what the Russians want to do is put together a regional design that would provide for the security not only of Russia, which they are obviously interested in, but also Europe and us. And I think it's a grave error to misinterpret and misunderstand what the Russians want. This is a once in a, not, I don't want to say a century opportunity, but certainly an opportunity that should not be missed for President Trump to sit down and with his advisors and design a new way forward for security in Europe that does not involve any future conflict, that will reduce the tensions, change the way we do business. It's so vital at this stage because the Russians are not interested in attacking anybody in the West. And they don't like the idea, obviously, of British troops or any NATO troops inside Ukraine policing the DMZ. You know, even though they admit that, yes, we think Ukraine has to be neutral, what's the point of neutrality if you're going to set the situation up like that? So the Austrian model, which is really the model I think that the Russians would accept, is not really on the table. And I don't think the president understands he has no leverage over the Russians. None. This looks like the same plan that he and Mr. Flights put together. I don't think it's going to go anywhere because it involves the things which Lavrov and Putin have said are unacceptable to them. And I don't see any evidence that the Russians are going to change their position. They are not going to accept some sort of line based on a frozen conflict. They're not interested in a Korean-style solution that leaves a demilitarized zone between East and West Ukraine. I think General Kellogg, like most people in Washington, are permanently frozen in the Cold War. They see everything through a lens that is distorted. They don't understand how the world has changed. They don't understand our limitations and our capabilities any longer. They're living in a world that passed over the last 30 plus years. They think this is 1991. It's not. The Russians right now have an enormous amount of military power concentrated in a couple of key places. One is across from Kiev, and the other is further south down near Kherson. They can move whenever they decide to move, and there's nothing the Ukrainians can do about it. We know that. If we continue to prevaricate and lie, as we have thus far, about the true state of affairs on the ground, they will eventually move. And there won't be anybody to sign anything because it won't be necessary. The entire Ukrainian state will have collapsed, and the Ukrainian population that remains is not going to put up a fight at this stage because they've had enough. So you'll end up with the Russians in charge, period. And we will have thrown away any opportunity we might have ever had to help shape some sort of outcome that would have been remotely beneficial to Europe or the Ukrainians. You know, I was hoping that President Trump would realize that the policy in Ukraine is dead. I would argue that the policy in the Middle East is also dead, but immediately end what's happening in Ukraine, get out of it. But instead of that, he seems to have decided to extend it, perhaps because he thinks he can extract some goodness from it. After all, he's arguing that in return for rare earths, we would provide more military aid. Well, I don't know who the military aid will go to. I mean, there are 1.2 to 1.5 million dead Ukrainians. They can't replenish the ranks. There are no substitutes. The state of Ukraine is effectively destroyed. So where is he going to get the people to operate the equipment he gets? I think it's ridiculous. But apparently that's President Trump's idea that if he could extract rare earths from them, that would be a benefit. The problem is the rare earths are all in the areas that are populated with Russians, and the Russians currently control them. So you're not going to get any rare earths out of that. There's $7.8 trillion supposedly worth of rare earths. They are all under Russian control in eastern Ukraine, which is Russian. That's everything from graphene to beryllium to lithium, any number of different things. In fact, there's a major lithium mine also in that area of eastern Ukraine. There were always coal mines there. And coal mines, in the seams of the coal mines, you get rare earths, by the way. We've got that here in the United States, being a big source of frustration for me that we're not maximizing our focus on that. But having said that, the only thing worth having in Western Ukraine,
where there are no rare earth deposits, as far as I know, or anything else, that is the black earth, the rich agricultural land. Well, here's an interesting flash. Cargill, DuPont, and Monsanto already have bought up the rights to most of the land in Western Ukraine. So I don't know how he handles that, but this is part of Mr. Zelensky's effort to sustain himself and his regime in power by selling off assets. But the rare earths in particular, forget it, President Trump, you're never going to see them. There is an assumption in the Trump administration that Ukraine is a viable state. It is not. There is an assumption that the Ukrainian military, with additional aid, can recover and continue to fight. That is untrue. There is an assumption in the Trump administration that they can overcome the corruption that riddles the country by extracting some benefit from rare earths. That's not going to happen. The 7.8 trillion of those are in the eastern part of Ukraine under the Russians. And there's this other underlying assumption: Russia's bad. Russia's the enemy. President Trump knows better than that. These people are not the enemy of us. They're not the enemy of Western Europe or Eastern Europe. There's no interest in going to war with us. And he should step forward and make that clear. But for some reason, he's decided to stay on point. That's why I said the clinging to this carcass of dead policy is a serious mistake. If he doesn't get out of this and distance himself from the folly and stupidity of his predecessors, it could well drag him into the pit. Well, I think it's useful to point out that, as far as we can tell, he receives, this is the president of Ukraine in the form of Zelensky, $11 million a month. That's his salary. So we can certainly point to waste, fraud, and abuse there. That's what the Russian and actually the Ukrainian press, it's out there, $11 million a month. And then on top of that, we could point to his real estate holdings. They're worth tens of millions, and we don't even know with certainty which banks hold enormous quantities of cash. So I would say that he is probably the chief thief in Ukraine. Now, he would probably argue that he's not, that he's had to pay off oligarchs who backed him. That may be true. But the real point is we've sent a lot of money over there. We know that a lot of it was essentially put into this laundering machine in Washington, D.C. that allows us to ship equipment and pay for it right here in Washington. But the equipment goes to Ukraine, but cash, not so much. But we've still sent enough cash in terms of hundreds of millions from time to time that he's being able to pay off his government. Everybody in the parliament is richly rewarded for their support. And of course, the officers in command of Ukrainian troops are earning vast sums of money. It is one giant scam. It makes Bernie Madoff look like a patriot in the United States compared to this man. The rare earth deposits that we know of are in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. These areas are controlled by the Russians. They're historically Russian. They're Russian again, and that's not going to change. I don't know if anybody has briefed President Trump on that. So this is not a department store where you're unhappy with your purchase and you want to go back and get your money. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't see how we extract any price from anybody for the stupidity of what the Biden administration has undertaken. In fact, I hope President Trump is going to look into this massive sum of money that belonged to the Russians that we effectively confiscated with the goal of turning it over to the Ukrainians, especially as it becomes increasingly clear how hundreds of billions of dollars and euros and so forth have disappeared into the black hole and ended up in Zelensky's bank account along with a number of his criminal buddies. So hopefully, President Trump will recognize that that's not going to happen. So I think what he's saying, he's subtle, which he has to be, obviously, but he's making it clear the future is not going to look like the past. So you can hang up any expectations or hopes that we're going to commit to some long-term reversal of the gains in this war by the Russians. Secretary Haig says comments are a breath of fresh air. They give us hope that we can actually reach some sort of final outcome in the region that could be good for us, good for the Russians, and good for the Europeans. And he's telling the truth. We've struggled with this, as you know, I and many others,
for months and months and months. And the media has pushed back with just an inexhaustible source of lies about how well things are going for Ukraine and the Russians are miserable and they're losing and they're committing atrocities. All of that was nonsense. What President Putin will want are confidential discussions. He's not interested in, grabbing the stage for a big splash in the media that something great has happened and I, Donald Trump, have done it. If President Trump wants this to succeed, President Trump should go back to saying what I heard him say the other day. We're talking and we're making progress. Thank you. Next question. Stop talking about the details. Don't get into it. Hegseth did a good job thus far. Let's leave it there. And if we're going to send the envoy over, let that all happen behind closed doors and let nothing be leaked or shared until there is substantive agreement. You'll recall back in the 80s, people used to talk about, let's have a Gorbachev summit. It became a metaphor for the major heads of state showing up and agreeing to something after there had been long, exhausting negotiations to get an agreement. Well, I think that's where we need to go now. So I hope that whatever the president says, he's going to go back to what he said before. We're talking, we're making progress. Thanks very much. That's the right answer. And what Hegseth has said is encouraging, but it's not an end state. The only end state really of great importance to us is that NATO has nothing to do with Ukraine and no American forces will be involved. That's good news. The rest of it, I think, is negotiable, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. At this point, I don't know what Moscow is willing to accept. Moscow has been very resistant, obviously, anything with the NATO label on it. But I'm not really sure that Moscow wants to see any foreign troops at all on Ukrainian soil. Now, these are where the details become important. Are these non-NATO forces going to go in and, quote unquote, demilitarize Ukraine? In other words, are they going to remove any of the remaining equipment that poses a threat to Russia? Are they going to have a hand in policing the place to ensure that there are not underground cells being secretly supplied by MI6 or CIA to start another insurgency against Russia? I don't know. I mean, these are the kinds of things the Russians are going to ask. Again, I think this is a move in the right direction, but I don't think there's any interest in freezing anything along any lines of contact at this point. And the difference between Vietnam and what's happened in Ukraine is clear and unambiguous. The Russians have won. So they're not going to give much up unless they're absolutely certain of what this outcome looks like. So I think that's a huge improvement. The fact that there will be no Americans involved is nice. But again, I think the Russians would also like a larger security architecture. And that's something that President Trump should be very interested in, because he was always interested in reducing our profile overseas, particularly in Europe, also in Northeast Asia. And a new security architecture is the way to do that. I think the Russians are going to take the position, when you come back and you have a real proposal that is going to meet our needs, our security needs, we'll talk. That hasn't happened yet. Now, that doesn't mean this is not better than what we saw before. And it's hard to judge what Moscow will accept. But remember, the Russians have lost, 90,000 dead. I don't know the numbers of wounded, but fortunately, half of those or more have been returned to duty, and another 10,000 non-Russian army dead. In other words, people that are not part of this Russian army per se. That's a lot of people under any circumstances, far more than we lost in Vietnam. So I think we're getting closer and closer and closer to the point where the Russians will talk to us, because we're effectively repeating back to them what they've been saying for months. And they were always ignored by Biden. Now, as far as Minsk goes, remember that Minsk, as we now know, and Macron has said this as well, not just Mrs. Merkel, who was in the chancellorship at the time in Germany, was designed to buy time for this Ukrainian reactionary criminal state to build up an army and a force with which it could attack Russia. Now, that's what we mean when we don't want another Minsk round, because it was meaningless. There was no intention on the part of the West to ever implement anything. And the sad part is that ultimately, between
2014 and the outbreak or the beginning of this intervention by the Russians in 2022, more than 14,000 Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk were killed by the incessant attacks by the Ukrainians. So I think, that's what we need to understand about Minsk. Minsk was a fraud, and it was perpetrated to confuse and mislead and beguile the Russians. So when he says no more Minsk, I think he's sending a signal, as is Donald Trump, we're not going to go down that road. I hope so, because one of the things that we've got to be certain of is that we tell the truth. You can lie in a domestic context, as most politicians do, about a lot of things. In international relations between great powers, you have to be absolutely truthful. Let's keep in mind that everything that Secretary Hegseth has said has been said by the Russians for months. He's simply repeating back to the Russians what they've said. So that's fine. I happen to have agreed with that from the very beginning. When it comes to security guarantees, depends on how you interpret that. This is back to the idea of a larger security architecture, which is designed to prevent any further outbreak in the future. The notion that you're going to force the Russians into anything at this point, particularly in Ukraine, is absurd. That would be similar to saying, we're going to force the Americans to come to terms with the Mexicans, and you're sitting in Beijing. It's absurd. It's not going to happen. It's ridiculous. We need to stop talking about that. But this is part of the national narcissism, which is almost terminal inside the Beltway. People can't step away from the possibility that our power is not limitless. The other thing is, given the way things are going in the Middle East, you could be in a major regional war in 30 days, and the price for a barrel of oil could go to $90 or $100 a barrel overnight. So I think this is all nonsense about energy. We're not going to threaten the Russians in any way, shape, or form in a way that makes any sense. Look, what have we done for years? I mean, this hostility to Russia, what good has it done? It's been self-defeating. If there's a lesson to be learned from this disastrous Biden administration, is it's all self-defeating. So let's drop all this silly language and nonsense about how great we are and how we can force this or that. It's all trash. Get rid of it. Dump it. And President Trump made it very clear to me and anybody else who cared to listen to him years ago that he thought the Europeans should be their own first responders. In other words, this reliance on U.S. forces to go thousands of miles from the continental United States into Europe to marshal air and naval power on a moment's notice to defend Europe was ridiculous. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense from the threat standpoint because Russia doesn't present that kind of threat, nor is Russia interested in it. And he's tried repeatedly to persuade the Europeans they must be responsible for their own defense. I think what probably President Trump would like, and I'm sure Secretary Hegseth would probably be receptive to this, is that fine, if this NATO thing survives, that's great, but you've got to take the lead. And remember, all the times you and I have spoken, the op-eds I wrote saying over and over and over again, a European four-star should replace the American four-star. We've got to get out of the business of taking responsibility for the command and defense of the European theater. That's not our problem. And I think at the end of the day, I think that's really what Secretary Hegseth is saying. Let's get out of this. We'll backstop you. We will stand by you, in the event of a serious conflagration. We'll back you up. But you've got to take the lead and defend yourselves. I think that's very clear. I think that's what President Trump wants, and he should want it, and the Congress should want it. But we all know Congress will fight it because you're disrupting a money flow that's become very, very useful for a lot of people, only not the American people. I think we're living in a different age now. I don't see any interest in Germany among any Germans in invading France, or the French are not interested in fighting with the Italians or the Spaniards. I mean, this stuff's over with. Eastern Europe, there's some unfinished business, let's be frank. And that's going to come to the fore. Hungary lost a great deal in World War I and even more after the Second World War. That's unfinished business. There's unfinished business for them in Ukraine. There's unfinished business with Poland in Ukraine. But these things are not our affair. And these things will have to be sorted out regionally. I think the world collectively ever since the 1970s has been moving towards greater regionalization, Dan. In other words, instead of seeing the global community as a community, we need to see the global population organized into major powers in each of the region that operate as arbitrators and maintain peace, security, and build prosperity. This is something that was predicted by a man named Hedley Bull at Oxford, long before anybody wrote The Fourth Turning or Toffler's Waves or anything else. I think we're there. Well, I have a newsflash. There have been disputes and conflicts all over the world for thousands of years, long before we existed. There will be more conflicts and disputes after we're dead. In other words, once we leave, will there be a potential for disputes and conflicts? Yes. But the Europeans, certainly before the First World War, demonstrated pretty conclusively after the Napoleonic Wars that they could handle those things. I think Europe will devolve to some extent into new regions, because the problem in NATO was always the same. The view of things from Berlin did not match the view from Madrid, and the view from Paris had nothing to do with the view from Stockholm or Athens. And that's more true now than ever. So I think you're going to see new security arrangements emerge, which is fine. They should, because they have a greater chance of succeeding than anything we impose. And right now, NATO is a legacy of our imposition, let's be frank. Eisenhower pointed out when he was president, a group of Army generals came in to but make presentations to the president about their need for more transportation to move more forces to Europe. And they said they had to have 29 divisions in Europe to stop the Soviets. And he said, how many divisions have you got that you could conceivably send? Well, we only have 15 divisions. He said, well, then find out what the shipping requirements are and the aviation requirements are to move 15 divisions. You're not getting anything more than that. Well, that took the wind out of their sails. But then he privately pointed out, look, we're never going to get across the Atlantic and the Pacific again the way we did during World War II. It can't be done, or World War I. The submarines, the long-range precision strike, the growing overhead constellation of ISR. He said, this is going to be impossible. So if we put something over there, it stands an excellent chance of ending up at Dunkirk, a giant Dunkirk. And even then, we may never get the troops out. So the whole idea, this old paradigm, is dead. We can't repeat any of that. So the answer is no. The Europeans must take the lead. They must take responsibility for their own security. Defense of the Western Hemisphere is critical now. Our country's in a lot of trouble. Our open borders have created chaos here inside the United States. And that's what's most important at all. There's going to be very little that we can do beyond our borders. We're in a position very similar to the British Empire at the turn of the century. The British Empire had a marvelous navy. We have a good navy. We have good air forces. There are places we can go if we need to temporarily, but we cannot become a permanent presence anywhere, because we are ultimately a maritime and aerospace country. We're not a land power anywhere but in the continental United States, which is why I keep arguing you got to get the Army back here, and you got to get the Army back in the business of national defense, which is defense of our borders, defense of the United States. So that's the first answer to the question. The second part of it is, yes, in small numbers, depending upon the situation, we can lend support or assistance to someone. But even then, it's very risky. The British tried to rescue the Greeks who came under attack by the Italians and the Germans. And the great British Navy did all that it could, but it was no match for the German Air Force and the German Army. And it would play out very similarly with the Russians. So I'm afraid we've got to be very careful about promises we make that we can never keep. So we ought to back away, encourage people to do what is in their interest, and consider carefully the limitations of our abilities to support anybody else beyond the Western Hemisphere. First of all, we're going to reinvigorate the energy industry. We're going to drill, baby, drill. Well, first of all, we're a long way behind where we were a few years ago. We are not extracting nearly as much as we did. The shale extraction is not developing dramatically at this point. We haven't built new rigs. We haven't built any new refineries. I mean, I could go down the list. The oil industry has had no incentive to invest in anything new because every time they turned around, Washington hit them over the head with all this environmental business. And of course, that's hurt us as a country, hurt us as a nation. So you're not going to get anywhere very quickly just because you say, I want to drill for oil and I want more oil and I want more gasoline. Forget it. It doesn't work that way. It's not a switch, that you switch on. That's the first part. And I think the second part is very obvious what you said. If you were to destroy that price, it would hurt us here very, very badly. This is not going to work. This is a dumb idea. This once again assumes that we're the center of the universe and that we can drive prices everywhere. We can't. Our market is not the only market anymore. We've been through this how many times? The Chinese, last year we had $1 trillion trade deficit. Last year they had $1 trillion trade surplus. They have more manufacturing capability and power than the United States and Europe combined. It is China that right now and for the foreseeable future is going to be the economic engine driving everything on this planet. That doesn't mean we're bad or weak or falling behind. For most of the last 2,000 years, China was the largest driving market in the world. It's not a new phenomenon. China simply regained what it had 100, 200, 300 years ago. So we got to stop talking in these foolish terms because the only people that are impressed with that are the few Americans at home that don't know anything, that are out of touch with reality and like hearing wonderful things about themselves. The rest of the world just looks at us like, how stupid can you be? And they're right. We're being very stupid right now. And frankly, at this point, from an American standpoint, that's fine. The United States doesn't need it. What we need is good relations with everybody in Europe, and we don't need to have to garrison the place to get those. So I think all of this is bound up with what President Trump is thinking. And I'm really glad to hear the things that Secretary Hegseth has said because they are a breath of fresh air. Well, this is important to understand that whenever I've been critical of President Trump on the question of what to do about Ukraine since he took office, I fully support the president on his domestic policies, and I think they're going in the right direction. He set a lot of positive forces in motion. Strongly support those. My concern has always been not to be distracted by events overseas, that if he could lose control here at home because there are far more serious crises that are closer to us, and that's where he should focus. Now, having said that, I think we have to understand a couple of things. He came in and he adopted this false narrative that had been spun up over the previous years in London and Langley, and then repeated ad nauseum by the media that we're all willing servants of this war. He's got to sweep that aside. He's got to get back to basics and go back to something that he did indicate a long time ago. This is not his. He did not start this. He did not want this. He said repeatedly it wouldn't have happened had he been there, fine. But now he needs to make it very clear this is not his, and he wants to end it. Now, he doesn't have to get a quote-unquote win over the Russians. Believe me, if he ends this, he gets a win at home, here, with the American people. They don't want anything to do with this war with Russia, and certainly don't want the risk of any kind of nuclear conflagration. Absolutely not. So that's his win. The Europeans win because they're ultimately going to replace these terrible governments, these globalists that have sacrificed over 1 million Ukrainian lives and hundreds of thousands of Russians to nothing for no purpose when it was completely unnecessary. They need to go away and they need to be expelled and removed. Now, as far as whether or not NATO survives, I don't think it will. I think NATO is increasingly an empty facade. And it may be one of these things, well, it ended with a whimper, not a bang. It may just quietly sink into the abyss and vanish. It's not meaningful. So I think right now with President Trump in the White House, he is unwilling to commit forces in direct combat against the Russians. And for that matter, the Chinese. I noted recently that the website for Taiwan in the State Department had suddenly changed radically. And there was a statement on the website that said, we reaffirm the one China policy. So I thought that was a dramatic departure from all the nonsense from his predecessors. That's something we should greet, because I can't conceive of anything dumber and more dangerous than a war with China, which would benefit nobody, least of all us. So I think that's an indication of where President Trump is thinking in Asia. I think he wants to avoid that with Russia, but the real key at this stage of the game is what he does in the Middle East with Mr. Netanyahu. I would say there are three things that are driving everything. Mr. President Putin in Russia, he's clearly in control. He's won the war. He holds the strategic high ground. Then there's Mr. Netanyahu, who for various reasons has control of us, our military power, our strategic interests in the region. And then finally, it's the border and the potential for the border to really explode into all-out war. There will be a war on the border with Mexico. That's coming. And what we're doing right now are half measures. And that is going to blow up in our faces, because there's a tremendous amount of money at stake for the cartels in Mexico. Anyone who pays attention to the president of Mexico is wasting their time. Just like the 10,000 troops that the president of Mexico said they'd put on the border, they're all on the payroll for the cartels as well. They'll do what they're told by the cartels. It is an organized crime state. It's a simple fact. That's going to become a war zone in the future. And we need to be prepared for that. That should be our focus, because that could destroy us as a country. Nothing happening right now in Eastern Europe or the Middle East needs to concern us as much as what's happening in Mexico and on the border and inside our own country, as you saw recently in Los Angeles. We have to understand that our economy is completely financialized. Someone said to me the other day, Doug, we don't have an economy at all. We have a financial system that owns the economy. I think that's a good way to look at it. These gentlemen that you mentioned are part of that development, that structure of power. I'd be surprised if it were not the case. And I read something, and then I watched briefly Alex Kreiner, who is a very fine financial analyst. He's somebody that you should consider bringing on to look at this from a political standpoint. But he pointed out that obviously the government in London is going to fall because the British economy is moribund and the financial system is going to crash. Now, one of the symptoms of this has been the London Metals Exchange, where the Bank of England is suspiciously may not have the gold in its vaults that it's supposed to have. Now, what gold is there is being extracted by investors in the United States. Apparently, they seem to want to get out before there is a quote unquote margin call and the true dimensions of the scam are revealed. At the same time, you have an interest in the United States with people like Mr. Lutnick, who are connected to the City of London banking system, the people over there, to backstop the losses in order to prevent a wholesale collapse of the financial system in London. And it is rumored, and this is where Kreiner comes in, and he knows more about this than I do, but he suggested they're actually talking about using U.S. treasuries in a sense to backstop by essentially putting them up for sale in an exchange in London. But the problem is there's nothing behind it. And I think that's where we're headed in England. No matter how hard people try to rig the system, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about putting treasuries into the pool of assets on which the banks depend for solvency and effectiveness, that's pretty much the end. So you're talking about a system that's doomed. The objection to it would be, I suspect, in the United States from investors, well, when that falls apart and the government goes down and the bank collapses, what happened to our assets? They're gone. Now, this is something we've never done before. At least I can't find any evidence for it. We've always sold. No. This is somebody said to me, well, look, you got a lemonade stand and there's another lemonade stand that's out of lemonade. So you go over to them and you pour some lemonade into them to keep them going. In other words, why should we put ourselves at risk? Because then we'll end up in the same position. It's a very fishy set of circumstances. It's something that most of us never look at because, frankly, that's not where we're focused. But this is something that deserves a lot of attention in the financial markets, and it deserves attention from Americans who care about the United States. I think he's someone who's grown up in New York and expects that the people that surround him will take profits as they can to enrich themselves, and probably doesn't see anything wrong in that. But more important, he may not really understand the fragility of the situation in London. You know, when Truss was removed as prime minister, she came in gangbusters with a plan to do everything that Margaret Thatcher had done. It was made very clear to her, we can't raise taxes, we can't cut taxes. We don't have the funds. We don't have anything that you want to do. And so she lasted for a few months. It was gone. I think that's where Starmer is right now. Only his position is far worse. He's talking about shipping billions of pounds to Ukraine, which is absurd since Ukraine is a bottomless pit with nobody in it anymore. But more important, they don't have it to send. And when this Bank of England goes under, there's going to be chaos. And that's going to have an impact on the continent. It's going to have an impact here in the United States. I think we're going to see a ripple effect.